Over the last 15 years, we have developed and refined an intervention for at-risk children. We call it TBRI, Trust-Based Relational Intervention. Now, this intervention is based on optimal principles for development rooted in research from the last 50 years with children, but it was designed in its early days for use with at-risk or vulnerable children. Well, many people will say the children I am serving or the children in my home are not at risk. Let me define for you the risk factors that cause TBRI to be an ideal environmental intervention. First is a difficult pregnancy. There's astounding research by Tiffany Field at University of Miami Medical School that took a urine assay from women in their 6th month of pregnancy. Dr. Field identified two groups of women, those who were anxious, depressed, and those who were not. When she took the urine sample, she got measures of the chemicals called neurotransmitters that their bodies had used and then thrown off. And much to her amazement and in the amazement of her colleagues, what she found was that for women who were just anxious or depressed, the levels of the stress chemicals called catecholamines was higher. And those stress chemicals predicted prematurity and low birth weight when they were very high. Now, when the babies were 1 month of age, they took urine from the diapers and they did the same test. And what they discovered was that the babies whose brains had developed in the uterus of a mother who was anxious or depressed, that child also had higher levels of stress chemicals. In addition, she discovered that those children had different brain activity, with one hemisphere being more active, one lobe being far more active than the other. So for a child just coming from a mother who's a little anxious and depressed, we can already predict anxiety disorders and or later aggressive disorders. We can already identify cognitive delays and learning problems. That's not a woman who was malnourished, a woman who didn't get prenatal care. That's not a woman who was fighting with her husband during the pregnancy, a woman who was working 3 jobs to bring food in for the rest of the family. So a difficult pregnancy is the most profound harm that happens to a developing child. Then a difficult birth is the second primary risk factor. Some children have birth experiences that can be called traumatic. Some are locked into birth canal too long. Some have unnatural birth by cesarean where their body doesn't get the natural type of healing, the kind of crushing actually it comes through the uterus, and those children are more susceptible to certain types of illness throughout their lifespan. But also difficult birth in a certain percentage of children in every population, there will be small brain hemorrhages at birth. And so a difficult pregnancy is the highest risk factor. A difficult birth is the second. Then early hospitalization. Now, some children have life-saving procedures when they're very young. These procedures are painful. If you've ever visited a neonatal intensive care unit, you will see children, tiny, tiny children, with needles in their arms and needles in their little legs, and you'll see them with beeping and buzzing of sounds of alarms that are on their body for their heart monitors and so forth. It is very traumatic. Now, early hospitalization may be medical trauma, but the child is not receiving touch and nurture where their mama should be able to hold them and sing to them. Their daddy should be able to put this child on his strong shoulder and walk them and cradle them. This child is locked in by medical procedures to save their life. So early hospitalization is very traumatic in the developing brain. And then the 3 risk factors that we usually think of: abuse, neglect, and trauma. There are many types of abuse: emotional, sexual, physical. There are many types of neglect. A good parent who's too tired to care for their child, a parent who has a drug or alcohol problem and can't, again, maybe a working single parent who's doing too many jobs and just trying to bring in food to the household. In the worst case scenario, children who come from drug abusing parents or children who come from orphanages. But there are many, many types of neglect. And then trauma can be medical trauma, again, hospitalization, surgeries. Trauma can be going through natural disaster. Katrina was definitely a trauma for the children that experienced it. Being in New York City at 911, there are many types of trauma. What we know from research is that under any of these circumstances, there are drastic changes in the brain chemistry. There are drastic changes in the child's belief system, and there are drastic changes in the brain's capacity to process the senses, called sensory processing disorder. So the children that we serve typically have at least one of these risk factors. Many of the children we serve have had virtually all. This is a optimal intervention, coming back to TBRI, for an optimally developing child. But for a child who comes from hard places, that would be a child who had a difficult pregnancy, a difficult birth, early hospitalization, abuse, neglect, or trauma. Trust-based relational intervention is an absolutely ideal relationship model for bringing deep healing to these children and youth. Now the question is, what is TBRI? So let me give a brief overview of what it is. TBRI is a set of principles, again research-based. This is important to keep in mind. There are 3 sets of guiding principles in trust-based relational intervention. I'll name them briefly and then go back and elaborate. There are principles for the body called empowering principles. Then there are principles for the spirit we call connecting principles. And then finally, principles for the mind, will, and emotions, the soul, that we call correcting principles. Now, thinking about these 3 components, body, soul, and spirit, what we're doing is honoring what we would call whole child. We're looking to meet physical needs, emotional needs, and behavioral issues can be solved without force when we have met these primary conditions. So, empowering principles, our first set. I'll give you a couple of examples. One would be, for example, transitions. Empowering principles are those who set the foundation for success. These meet the physical needs of a child. So, in the lives of all children, transitions can be challenging. Getting up in the morning, going to bed at night, changing the plans for the day, doing something different, turning off the television when it's time to go to bed. These are all examples of daily transitions. And transitions can be highly disruptive for the child from hard places. Remember, again, this child has a different brain, a different belief system, and a different set of behaviors that evolved out of their history of harm. So transitions are particularly difficult for them. For these children, we might say, in 2 minutes, we're going to go turn off the TV and get ready for bed. Now, for a child that's got more fragile brain chemistry and more fragile sensory issues, we might do multiple transitions. Sweetie, in 10 minutes, we're going to leave this class and go to the next class. Hey guys, now in 5 minutes, we're going to leave this class. And ultimately, we may say, in just 1 minute. And so we give the child a chance to shift gears. Another part of the empowering principles is what we would call bodies and brains. We are looking at things that impact the body in such a way that it has a dramatic influence over behavior and belief systems. Now, we learned many, many years ago with early Head Start types of programs that children who are hungry cannot learn. That's a simple example of empowering. We know that children whose blood sugar is addressed on a regular basis can learn better. We know that children who have food every 2 hours are going to have higher levels of cognitive performance, which enhance their ability to do good behaviors. We also know, for example, that the brain of children who come from hard places are more likely to have elevated levels of one chemical that's called glutamate. Now, unfortunately, if a child is dehydrated, glutamate is far more active in the brain. This is very unfortunate for caregivers and parents because glutamate drives aggression, agitation, irritability, and glutamate's involved in medical problems such as seizure. So simply by bringing food every 2 hours and hydration capacity, water every 2 hours, we are empowering the children that are in our homes or the children that are in our classrooms. We are empowering and setting the ground for success for the kiddos that we serve. Now, there are also a set of connecting principles, and I would say this is truly the heart and soul of who we are. Connecting principles let that child know that they can trust us, that they can be safe with us. Now, a lot of children are safe with caregivers, with teachers, with parents, with foster families, but they still don't know they are safe. Unfortunately, a research was done a number of years ago by a researcher that looked at a large study of kids adopted from Romania into Canada. And what she found was that 5 years after their adoption, a significant number of those children still had cortisol, the stress chemical, that was 5 times what it should have been. So what we know is just because a child is safe doesn't mean they feel safe. So we're doing things like engagement principles, where we're looking gently into the child's eye, where we maybe touch their shoulder or hand when we talk to them. We're getting down to the level of a smaller child or standing and looking directly into the eyes of an older child, and we'll elaborate more of this later. Another part of connecting is mindfulness. I'm always mindful where that child has come from. So we set 2 types of bars. One is a historic bar. So do I expect that this child is able to trust? Do I know where this child has come from? How much can I expect? But then another set of bars that we'll elaborate on later is what's happened today. Is the child overly sad, overly tired? Has this been a stressful day, a long day? So I'm mindful of what the child needs from me, but I'm also mindful of what I bring to the equation. When this child looks into my face, are my eyes caring? Are they warm? Is my voice sympathetic and compassionate, or is my voice harsh? Does my stance tell this child they're safe with me, or do I look like a drill sergeant when I talk? And am I mindful? What does this behavior really mean? We ask ourselves 2 things when a child misbehaves. What is he really asking for, and what does he really need? And so I think of an example. My 4-year-old grandson was at my home some time back, and his daddy said it was time to go. He's a child with prenatal trauma, and so his little brain chemistry is fragile, and he burst into tears and started screaming and crying. And I knelt down on my knees in front of my little grandson, and I put my hand on his shoulder, and I said, "Sweetie, I'm so sad that you have to go home too." And he dropped his head on my shoulder and wept. Now, angry for that child, if I'm mindful of what he's saying and what he really needs from me. Angry in that case was a child who was profoundly sad to leave his grandma's house. So connecting is the heart and soul of what we do. Connecting and empowering are the reasons that we're so successful at correcting and changing behavior. Now, we're going to talk in the days that come about how to correct behavior. We'll talk about it in great elaboration. We have a set of strategies that are quite effective, but they are effective because we are connecting and empowering. So correcting principles would include, for example, life values, such as showing respect. This is a non-negotiable for us. So we're going to talk with the kids about showing respect. We're going to also do things that we would call behavioral scripts. We're going to give children, for example, choices. We're going to do, for example, behavioral redos. And we're going to give children a voice to ask for compromises. In the days that come, we will elaborate all of these principles. But what you will find for any child in your home, in your classroom, in the facility where you serve, trust-based relational intervention is an ideal intervention for bringing about deep and lasting change in children, all children, those who have come from hard places and those who have not.